Revelations. Welcome to video 8 of my Antidote to Tyranny. This will also be the equivalent to chapter 17 within Graham K. Griffiths' book Behold Jerusalem, and as such will feature in my Albion Landscape video series, which is the serialisation of Graham's book. This is Graham's own work and the serialisation of the items that he was forced to leave out of his original book, Behold Jerusalem. And so this was written 14 years after that date, back in 2018. These revelations refer to graphical sexual innuendo and practices, so I've had to really lock this down and put it as adults only. Some of the subjects covered within this series of 5 are alluded to within the main book in chapters 1 through to 16, but go into a little bit more detail within this book, within this serialization of his revelations. After going through these revelations several times in the production of this video, I will at the end be releasing a 6th video within this set to actually put my views over what has been revealed and what can be said about the Albion Zodiac and what I believe its true nature is. I will now pass you over to the words of Graham K. Griffiths.
Article 4, and death shall have no dominion. Continuing the missing revelations as deleted from the book Behold Jerusalem. The discovery of the zodiacal miracle buried within the foundations of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. By Graham K. Griffiths. So too damn right am I now saying that the performing of the ancient Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony, their most sacred act of all, and this for the reanimating of the dead, played a part in Christ's own resurrection, and that the two guys whom actually carried it out were Joseph of Arimathea, and his Sanhedrin buddy, Nicodemus. I say this because these two were the only folk recorded as being left alone with the body of Jesus in that tomb. And blimey, can we even assume too that because we've discovered that sacred adds itself hidden, and tellingly so, beneath this Cumbrian Christ's loincloth, that at Golgotha that's precisely where he himself hid it too, because let's face it, that's the last place any Roman would have looked for anything else worth casting lots for. That said, surely Joseph or Nicodemus would have secreted this all-important resurrection implement into the tomb beforehand. Certainly, such would have been the easier option, but maybe this adze had to be placed next to Christ's own genitals while upon the cross. I don't know, but if the land has seen fit to place it upon this same intimate area, indeed, as a seeming replacement for the phallus itself, well it must be for one almighty reason. Either way, time now to take a quick look at the above two shadowy characters, and quick, it certainly will be as far as the Bible is concerned, because neither of them rates more than a couple of fleeting mentions. Okay, firstly the enigmatic Joseph. We know him to have been Jesus' uncle, and who is recorded as having begged the release of Christ's body from off the cross so as to lay it in his own private tomb. But we also know that not everything is recorded in the Bible, and it's via myth, legend that we're told of the young Jesus' supposed travels with this wealthy merchant to Britain. See my Article 1. This along with Joseph's most remembered act, until now, that is, re his gathering of a few drips of the dying Christ's blood and sweat into the cup as used at the Last Supper, and in which act he inaugurated the entire mythology of the Holy Grail. However, there is for us here upon the trail of an Egyptian wonder ceremony, a little thing worthy of note and which usually passes under the radar, this the fact that prior to being known as Joseph of Arimathea, he was Joseph of Marmorica. Marmorica being then in Egypt. I'm sure you'll catch my drift here in surmising that Joseph may have already known a thing or two about a certain Egyptian trick of raising the dead. Indeed, I can't help but go another provocative mile by asking if the real bodily fluid which he caught in that high cup, and this perhaps procured upon the previous evening in that upper room, upper itself code for the final and highest of all the Messiah's secret teaching, was Jesus' own semen, certainly would seem that the Gnostics may have got wind of such. See my Article 2 Part 2, for in remembrance of that first Eucharist reportedly sipped semen from their own high cup when celebrating Mass, and do recollect, again from Article 2 Part 2, that even the word Mass has its root in the word Mars, and which translates as male seed. Indeed, the usage of semen, in conjunction with that star a sperm meteorite adds, may well have been a key ingredient used by those Egyptian high priests in the original opening of the mouth ceremony. I certainly suspect so. Of course, no one can either verify or discount this my suspicion, but let's just keep on asking these questions, whether discomforting or not, for they are based purely upon that which this talking landscape seems to be pointing a very definite finger towards. Not to ask would, in my opinion, be a travesty. As for Nicodemus, the Bible of course records him as purchasing that absolute shed load of costly embalming ointment, 100 pounds of the stuff, so as to prepare the body of Jesus for that final entombment, but it's his other mention in John 3 which interests me, for it makes a point by telling us that he came to Jesus at night, so in secret, and the subject of their clandestine tete-a-tete was rebirth, so in effect, how not to allow yourself to merely rot in a box, bingo. Nicodemus to Jesus, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God. For no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of those signs which so impressed Nico was to do with the Lazarus incident. Anyway, Jesus replied, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Nonplussed, Nicodemus to Jesus, how can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born. Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Now I don't know about you, but some of Jesus' above explanations leave me feeling a bit dense. Or is it a case that whomever actually penned, or indeed did the editing and censoring job on all this, accidentally on purpose, made stuff a bit, shall we say, sketchy? It certainly wouldn't be the first time, and those reams and reams of commentaries, translations, and ongoing forums out there prove that some of the stuff in the Bible is, even after 2,000 years worth of decipherment and debate, still a bit hard for a regular Joe to get his head around. However, I think we get the gist of Jesus and Nico's chinwag, and it's got nought to do with that hip American style yippee, I'm a born-again Christian kind of thing. Anyway, their clandestine whispers continue with references to eternal life and stuff, but because Jesus notices that old Nicodemus was close to nodding off, he pretty well calls it a night with the following succinct one-liner, a line which has been described by some as the gospel in a nutshell. For myself it's rather the whole message of Jesus in a bombshell. That's if you read it alongside all we've been toying with in these my articles, especially so those events in a blacksmith's forge, and wherein even a lump of perished iron made itself anew. Anyway, Jesus finally says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. John 3 verse 16. Not perish, I ask you. And yet how sad that the exact details on how we may not perish via the hand of death are not specifically given, as I am sure Jesus would have said much more to his visitor regarding this, especially so because Nicodemus was to be present in that tomb of resurrection so as to aid Joseph in whatever was to go on in there. No matter, the stuff we're now delving into could well be the gist of that which was said, but which is not recorded. Either way, later on in this article we'll find that above, tingling one-liner of Jesus cropping up again, but this time buried beneath a gigantic granite phallus right bang in the middle of London. Staying with Nicodemus, you might be now surprised to learn that he has his very own gospel, although it'll be very unsurprising to also learn that it's in no way part of your pucker Bible, probably because it's far too easy to understand. Sorry, but I couldn't resist that one. It goes without saying then that this Gospel of Nicodemus is certainly an interesting read, and gives rise to the feeling that Jesus' confidant was indeed privy to some pretty heavy and intimate stuff, for one particular chapter is the harrowing of hell, and which could only have been originally narrated to Nicodemus by Christ whilst he himself was in the actual throes of his resurrection and metamorphosis within the tomb, for it was in such a limbo that Christ seemingly left his physical and damaged body so as to spiritually venture into hell, and once there he apparently raised up legions of the long dead before finally putting the ringmaster of this hellhole, Beelzebub, death himself, to flight. So you see yet again that the repeating crux of all this is the defeating of death, and preferably whilst still in the flesh. Now that's what I'd call being born again, this to the absolute truth of our immortality in this all-singing, all-conscious world around us, a revelation to enjoy even while feasting on our fish and chip suppers. But hold on there, bud. I hear someone heckle. This is all very hunky-dory, but if you're saying that Jesus attained resurrection via that opening of the mouth ceremony, and this in but 3 days, well, it's high time you gave us the nitty-gritty on what exactly Joseph and Nicodemus did, otherwise how the hell are we ourselves to get some of this death-defying action? Sure, I hear exactly where you're coming from, and I'll tell you right now that I'm at a loss as to the actual mechanics, whether of specific words, incantations, unctions, elixirs used in order to resurrect a person via that opening of the mouth ceremony. But what I can say is that it had very little to do with that scant info as filtered down to us today, for such was first committed to hieroglyphics at a time when the original secret procedures behind that rite had been forgotten, misinterpreted to the point where it had become a mere parody of that original, and which probably predated the version we have today by thousands of years. Once more, I can only refer you to these talking pictures in a landscape, and these, yet again, overlaid upon those mind-bending events within a blacksmith's forge, when even a decomposing lump of rusty iron, spat out of the mouth of Christ, totally defied every law in the book by transforming itself into something new and astonishing. See my Article 3. But before you cast a final judgment upon all I've put before you, allow me to unearth the final piece of mesmeric evidence on the ground, and which screams out in the most graphic in-your-face terms possible, to the effect that, and if I myself have hitherto been spouting befuddlement on a biblical scale, the one thing I've got totally crystal clear is that the paramount reason why this whole miracle under our noses has breached our consciousness is to tell us that we can, and like that piece of rusty junk, resurrect ourselves, indeed, to remake ourselves anew in real time, right now and on the spot, and in the same process finally kick death's ass, just like Christ did. Otherwise this colossal pictorial sign language our earth has created is seemingly for naught but an item of idle curiosity. A travesty indeed. Asterisk note. To that earlier heckler, however, let me say that I will, nevertheless, endeavor to offer up what might be a prerequisite ingredient this raising or reanimating of the dead, whether of the flesh, metal, stone, you name it, a little on. Please bear with me. Believe me, I really am now hitching to show you that which this smackingly graphic landscape has gone and done for its party piece. But before I can take you to see this oh so visually thrilling finale, I'm afraid you'll have to allow me 3 more plunges into what the ancient Egyptians may have known about how to likewise kick death's ass, and this thousands of years before Jesus ever drew breath. Firstly, Egypt's Great Pyramid, and in particular the theory of a growing number of esteemed researchers who believe that in no way was this extraordinary structure ever intended as a tomb, but rather as a celestially governed resurrection machine, albeit one whose pamphlet of working instructions has been lost, or maybe just hidden. Either way, to even voice such a possibility is of course to cause much nose-in-the-air scoffing amongst the ranks of academic Egyptologists whom are far happier with a tomb for the dead, rather than a womb wherein the dead might be rebirthed or resurrected. However, for us who are on the trail of a curious meteorite iron adze shaped as the constellation of Ursa Major, and intended for use in a ceremony to raise the dead, I think it may prove advantageous for us to have a thumb through Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert's fascinating and extremely learned book The Orion Mystery, especially the section where they discuss the 4 mysterious 8-inch square channels that are cut with laser-like precision through thousands of tons of the Great Pyramids. Granite, these starting from the inside of both the king and queen's chambers, and then proceeding right through to the outside of the structure. This another staggering piece of architectural know-how, yet previously only ever thought to be mere ventilation shafts, until, that is, in 1993 the German robotics engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a tiny remote-controlled robot, fitted with a camera, up these shafts. Well, and apologies for my cutting of a fascinating story of discovery short, it's fully recorded in the Orion Mystery. Let me tell you that the 2 southerly aligned shafts, one beginning in the king's chamber, the other in the queen's, were found to run perfectly straight and true, always climbing skywards, right through to the outside air. The 2 northerly directed shafts, however, and again, one leaving the king's chamber, the other the queen's, were shown to be majorly kinked, and this presumably because these 2 shafts had to be navigated over the top of the huge obstacle which is the Grand Gallery, so as to likewise continue their way to the outside, sign then of a rare architectural cock-up in the pyramid's construction, like somebody forgot to take into account the trajectory of those vents, but with a few deft kinks. Who'd know? Such was how this kinked anomaly was first viewed, but upon closer inspection of the overall shape of these 2 northerly aligned shafts Gantenbrink sensed they might not be errors of architectural judgment, but rather a deliberate design feature, and let's face it, those Egyptians were no mugs when it came to building that which is still seen as a wonder of the world. Indeed, Gantenbrink's hunch turned out to be correct, and how? Suffice to say that it quickly became apparent to those with eyes to see that these 2 kink channels were remarkably shaped in the form of that opening of the mouth adze Ursa Major. What's more, when their upward climbing trajectories were followed through to the night sky, it was seen that the channel beginning in the king's chamber led straight to the constellation of Alpha Draconis, while the one leaving the queen's chamber sped unerringly to Ursa Major. My copies of the 2 channels as referenced from the Orion Mystery. For comparison I have also included the extra illustrations. Asterisk note, the 2 straight channels also made their way to constellations, the one from the king's chamber finding Orion, while the queen, chamber 1 arrowed its way to Sirius. So what were the true reasons behind the incredible ingenuity which not only aimed these channels at certain constellations, but, and especially for us, why the explicit shaping of 2 of them into that of all shapes, and one of them even shooting straight out to Ursa Major, of all places? One can only deduce that these channels were cut for a purpose far more important than mere ventilation purposes, and fast upon the heels of that no-brainer, one can be entirely excused from further deducing that they could only ever have been for something of profound importance to their beliefs, and this surely pertaining to the raising of the dead. Indeed, Bauval and Gilbert, and presumably without any knowledge of an opening of the mouth adze hidden beneath the loincloth of Cumbria's crucified Christ, likewise point to the obvious. It now seemed certain that the ceremony for the opening of the mouth had been performed, perhaps several times, inside the Queen's chamber. And with that statement I can't but wonder now if the soul of the deceased either flew from its opened mouth along the granite channel like a bullet aimed at Ursa Major, that location of the realm of the afterlife, or else was it that this same soul actually winged its way back down this channel and thus straight back into the mouth of the deceased, thereby revivifying the corpse. Tell you what, to muse upon either possibility is mind-blowing enough, but for us who know now that there's one of these channel-shaped adzes hidden, see my article 2, parts 1 and 2, beneath Christ's loincloth, yes, he who is the absolute benchmark re all things resurrection, well, the extent to which our minds are being blown must surely now be off the scale. Whatever, I think with these joint evidences, both hidden within the innards of the Great Pyramid, and so too beneath a loincloth in Cumbria, between them enticingly endorse those theories re the Great Pyramid being once used, or still could be again, as a colossal resurrection machine. And yes, a seemingly crackpot theory, but when in a little while I show you the final masterstroke of Britain's monumental floor plan, I hope it will go some way to proving that Messrs. Bowell, Gilbert and Griffiths might not be quite so loony after all in their tinkering with the ignition wiring of a resurrection machine. But let's move on. Secondly then, the ancient Egyptian Bennu bird, or to us the phoenix. And what better symbol for resurrection than this legendary bird which from out of the ashes of itself arises anew? Well actually, there is another, it's of Jesus Christ, and it's entirely understandable that the firebird's own death-defying attributes were rejigged by early Christianity so as to become a metaphor for Christ's own resurrection. Although, it still intrigues me how this mythical bird of ancient Egyptian, and this of so heathen a heritage, ever got allowed to hover anywhere near their Messiah. That said, and sorry for keep teasing, but you'll see shortly how even the genius within this landscape has apparently willed not only that Egypt's very own wonder bird should be seen to be flying out of our Cumbrian Christ's own right hand, but that there's an actual, I told you I was hitching to tell ya, but I'm still not ready yet. Anyway, to the Egyptians this heron-like Bennu bird was also seen as presiding over the actual creation of the world, and was duly worshipped in their great temple of the sun, a mansion of the Phoenix at Heliopolis, and where in its honor the first ever obelisk was raised in representation of its sacred perch, this tapering pillar capped by the conical, pyramidion, Ben stone, and which was originally thought to be a colossal conical hunk of meteorite. Fallen meteorites often take upon a conical shape, this due to their hurtling through Earth's atmosphere. And what better material to stick upon the tip of that obelisk, phallus, than a solidified piece of their creator god Atom's fallen semen? Indeed, their word Ben, as in Ben stone, also meant seed. Tragically, the 19th century saw many of these beautiful pillars, although all of them stone rather than meteorite tipped, but their sexy message remains the same, felled and shipped to Europe as veritable garden ornaments, one of which still stands in front of the Vatican. Yep, an Egyptian cock rises in effort to remind Christianity what it's been missing, while another stands erect near the American White House. However, the one that should interest us the most is London's own Cleopatra's Needle. Although this particular phallus has nothing to do with her, rather it was made for Thutmose III, circa 1450 BC, and again erected in the city of Heliopolis, yes, that aforementioned location of the Temple of the Sun, and supreme roosting place of the self-resurrecting Bennu bird of Phoenix. For me then, London must have the most potent phallus of all those pilfered. Furthermore, either by some knowing hand, or via the subliminal promptings of the cosmic mind, and throughout this landscape zodiac of Britain are many an example of such, and in readiness for this time now, a time capsule was deposited beneath it just prior to its erection in its new location. Placed inside it were all manner of oddments, amongst which being 12 photos of the most beautiful English women of the time, perfect to cause a stir in this pillar of phallus, perhaps, a baby's bottle. Why, a rupee, what, a shilling razor, blimey, but most tellingly for us whom are here prodding unmentionable things, know that beneath this sperm-tipped perch of London's Phoenix is also a copy of John 3 verse 16, and this in 215 languages, yes indeed, that bombshell of a one-liner, as quoted earlier, which Jesus whispered into the ear-lug of Nicodemus. Wow, of all things to quote and leave beneath London's phallic and sperm-tipped perch of the death-defying Phoenix. And so damned important is this so-called gospel in a nutshell, and this alongside all that salmon-swallowed acorn wisdom stuff we found in the Dartmoor gut of Pisces. See my article 1. Well, you must forgive me for quoting such a second time. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. John 3 verse 16. Certainly, my earlier suspicions that the swallowing of sperm, whether in the gesture of that meteorite adze, or indeed, the genuine stuff, could somehow be the catalyst to some inconceivable metamorphosis re the resurrecting of one deceased, well, became less daunting, indeed, even a tad charming, when it recently dawned on me that the actual London location of Cleopatra's sperm-tipped needle, at least in Britain's zodiacal scheme of things, suggests that it could well be lodged in the very throat of the giant Sagittarius or Noah, see behold Jerusalem, and hence well and truly swallowed. And talking of Noah, well, he too must have known a thing or two about life preservation. Knocking up a grand 950-year lifespan. Wonder what his secret of longevity was? Asterisk note, but should you question my whole obelisk equals phallus theory, well, according to Freemasonry the word obelisk literally translates as ball's shaft or organ of reproduction. See Masonic and Occult Symbols by Dr. Kathy Burns. And thirdly, after death Osiris rises again as Horus, this the prelude for Jesus rising as the Christ. Seems then that the evil Set, not being content with the mere murdering of his brother Osiris, then went about trying to make sure the god was gone for good, firstly sealing the body in a coffin-like box before casting it adrift in the Nile. But when that didn't work, he frenziedly sets about chopping the corpse up into 14 cuts of meat before having the individual lumps then scattered willy-nilly throughout Egypt. But let's fast forward to where the goddess Isis, the sister or wife of Osiris, and this after many adventures in the tracking down of her lost husband's remains, eventually makes him whole again, although still as dead as a dodo, and unfortunately minus his penis, although this was later retrieved, it having been swallowed by a fish. Another hint perchance to all we found swallowed by Pisces? Oh, and what with that word Gil written upon Christ's Cumbrian lips, and an early sign for Christ being that of a fish, well, surely something fishy is going on here too? Anyway, we now catch up with Isis when she visits Osiris fully put back together again, corpse at night, for she didn't want anyone to see what she was up to, and in the form of a swallow, she miraculously manages to get the still very much dead Osiris somewhat aroused by fluttering around his genitals, and from which she, still as a swallow, I should add, was able to copulate with him and thus conceive of Horus. In short, a part of Osiris would then genetically live on in the shape of his son, also the story would have us believe. Not surprisingly, the exact details of this astonishing feat of copulation aren't shared with us, and we're left to surmise that it was purely down to a bit of magic. They were both deities after all. However, I'd like to attempt to put a different slant on this oddball conception of Horus, and for us upon this weird quest, may I ask if the real hidden gem within it is in that named variety of birdlike? Did Isis, as a woman, just prior to Osiris' murder, as they knew what Set was planning, perform fellatio on Osiris, and although not swallowing his semen, merely collected it in readiness to transfer it back into her husband's mouth, in so doing allowing him to re-swallow his own life back, so to speak, so as to somehow resurrect him, albeit with the new name of Horus, so as to disguise the real truth of his resurrection from Set? And would not this putting sperm into the mouth of Osiris have been the very essence of that opening of the mouth ceremony? For that meteorite adze was itself the symbolic semen of their creator god Atum. Thus was Isis depicted as a swallow, as a cunning cover story, albeit this seeded with a clue, so as to conceal the real swallowing business going on behind the scenes. What's more, if this scenario is indeed anywhere near the subtle subterfuge I suspect to be cloaking the real truth concealed within this myth, I must then ask if this rather taboo act of Isis was itself the very first demo of that particular ceremony, indeed, the prototype for that ceremony performed upon Jesus within Joseph's tomb thousands of years later? And with that possibility, let's stop beating around the bush, and question outright if in that adze beneath Jesus' loincloth, we are being prompted to see it as one and the very same with his penis, for there is no sign of any genitalia, only this adze marking the spot. Moreover, the next prompt must surely be that either his penis, coded now as that adze, or his semen, in the guise of that sperm of God, a meteorite iron as used in the actual making of the adze, was put into the Jesus' own mouth as part and parcel of some extraordinary procedure towards the bringing about his resurrection. Or, and if that's not already taboo enough for you, maybe for both Osiris and Jesus there was no symbolic gestures involved, and it was indeed their own semen which was gathered and then transferred back into their own mouths, thus making that sacred adze itself but a cover, a subtle code-come clue, not too unlike the biblical transposing of a thigh for a penis, for it was such bodily fluid, so charged with life, which was of paramount importance in the physical spiritual alchemy needed to return life back to the dead? For myself, I can't help thinking that something along these admittedly shocking and inconceivable lines could well be the truth behind it all, Isis herself being the collecting vessel of Osiris' semen, before he would himself drink of it. And was it Mary Magdalene who perhaps played Isis' role when she became herself the high cup, so to speak, for to collect Jesus' own sacred and life-giving fluid, and which after the crucifixion, and having his mouth reopened, was returned back into his body. As part of that most sacred Egyptian ceremony for the raising of the dead? Okay, at one end of the scale utterly freaking ludicrous, while at the other something bordering upon the pornographic, and in the context of Christ, for some, utterly repugnant. Listen, I totally get it, and feel myself somewhat uncomfortable in voicing such questions, but it is this picture-coded landscape which demands that I do so, and if it means I have to go where angels would themselves fear to tread, then so be it. Either way, whatever did happen to Osiris and Jesus behind closed doors meant that Osiris was resurrected bearing the new name of Horus, and so keeping the death-loving set off the scent that the dead could now actually live again via a certain secret ceremony. Just as Jesus was resurrected and named as the Christ. Therefore, Osiris plus Horus the risen Osiris, and this same sum applies equally to Jesus Christ the risen Jesus, Horus a Christ, both titles of one whom was resurrected. Oh come on, surely just by giving Osiris a new name wouldn't cut it with Set and the others who would know him instantly. And in any case, how did Isis get around the fact that she'd supposedly just given birth to Horus, the son of Osiris? Correct. So, because Isis was no mug, she very conveniently takes herself off to hide in the deserted marshlands of the Nile Delta, out of Set's sight, so as to give birth to Horus. Or so she said. Anyway, the story goes that once Horus had grown, he leaves that Delta safe house and goes to gain revenge on Set, he the so-called friend of the dead, and yeah, if Set had had a motto it would have been better dead than alive. Or was it just Osiris who just had a belly full of lying low and felt it time to give death, Set a resounding kick up the ass, just like Jesus would do thousands of years later? Asterisk note. Considering that there are in existence statues, as well as wall art depictions of Horus as a child, I guess you'd like to know how I wriggle out of that problematical fact. Well, these depictions are certainly of a much later period, and thus for me merely recording the already archaic myth based upon the spin put out by Isis. As to that moment when Horus, Osiris himself, did step back into public view, and when you'd think, if my take on the myth is correct, that Horus would have been soon outed as Osiris, well, Isis again had it all covered, for her cunning included the new characterization, a disguise of her husband as the new falcon, hawk-headed Horus, thus either by more divine magic, or via the simple handiwork of a very good headdress maker. She created the full hawk's head disguise for whenever Osiris went public. Realize too, that with this same Bennu bird, a phoenix, see earlier, headgear, because that's exactly what it was meant to be to the eyes of those who could both see and understand. Osiris was blatantly advertising the fact that like these mythic birds he too had risen, therefore, I give to you Osiris unmasked, and laughing his Egyptian cotton socks off. Time now to briefly step back and see Giza's Great Pyramid itself, indeed all pyramids, as a colossal magnification of the original obelisk's own cone of semen, and as you do note that the Great Pyramid also had a space left at its own tip so as to accommodate its own crowning Ben stone, pyramidion, albeit this stone, the symbolic phoenix itself, an emphatic image of resurrection, is curiously missing. Has this capstone always been missing, or was it removed for some reason? Either way, just know that I am about to return you to Cumbria, and in particular to the location of its beautiful lake district, because here I will show you another great pyramid, 136 miles wide by 18 miles high, and which has a bloody great phoenix rising from its tip, and with it too know that this pyramid, at least, is a resurrection machine. Because this finale, and this as if to ram home the fact that something intrinsically ancient Egyptian was behind Jesus' own, Osiris-like resurrection as Christ, will be seen to be streaming, or rising, from out of the right hand of Cumbria's own crucified Christ. And boy, how I'm going to enjoy showing it to you right now, just hold on to your hats. Okay, for those of you who have already read my book you'll know that the land sculpture which represents Aquarius is, and just as it is in the Glastonbury Zodiac, a gigantic phoenix, fire or water reasons aplenty in both Mary Cain's book, The Glastonbury Zodiac, and my own, and which ingeniously rises from the graphic tongues of flames which are the very lakes of this world-renowned watery, and perfectly Aquarian, corner of England. That said, this Lake District Firebird happens to be the only star giant I've found who is inverted, and yes, in a tarot card reading this would denote a negative vibe, this aspect again fully discussed in my book. However, when I look down upon this imagery as through the eyes of Cumbria's crucified Christ, this by turning the whole of Britain upside down, it dawned upon me that from this Christ's own viewpoint this phoenix wasn't inverted at all, and what's more, the bird seemed to be materializing from out of his own nailed right hand, this surely a provocative gesture in itself, and for me it can only be a direct pointer towards the mystic mechanisms involved in his own resurrection, but it gets better still. I then noticed how 8 of these lakes of flame seemed to lean slightly inwards like the directional folds of an open fan. Indeed, to my artist's eye they seem to be all pointing, whether sloping in from the right or left, to the same focal point of convergence. In other words, an exercise in basic perspective. So I took up my pencil and ruler and did just that by simply shooting a line along the straightest edge of each lake and seeing what happened, just for fun. Guess what? All these straight lines magically zeroed in, give or take a gnat's whisker, on the very same vanishing point, and bingo. I'd suddenly got myself, as near as damn it, a perfect pyramid with that already in situ Aquarian phoenix, Bennu bird rising perfectly from its apex. Staggering or what? Especially so when also taking into account the fact that we are about to enter into the new astrological age of Aquarius, thus a message particularly primed for us of these times now? You can bet your life that I whooped when I saw those lake-driven lines form a pyramid, and which from Christ's own viewpoint was the right way up. But you know me, as per usual, I still wanted more. So I had a closer look at the map so as to check if that actual vanishing point at its apex had a name. Yeah, it did. It was Hawk's Head, and not for the first time in my years of delving did a shiver run through me, and with it the now familiar realization that I was again in the presence of something conscious within this landscape, something looking back up at me from out of the map, something deeply sacred, and yet nevertheless benignly smiling, for it just wanted to play, yet at the same time impart a set of stunning images programmed to change our perception as to exactly why we're here. In total, a resurrection machine for our minds has appeared upon our doorsteps, and this to reawaken us to the true glory and potential of ourselves. So I say, behold Jerusalem. For if this rocky foundation of Britain can morph itself into a colossal mirror of the mythology our ancestors were inspired to bestow upon the heavens, well, just think what wonders us humans may now put our minds to in partnership with a nature, which via this miracle underfoot, proves that if genuine love is the prime mover behind our thoughts or wishes, then miraculous things will indeed transpire. In a nutshell, nothing but nothing is now impossible to us, for impossible, just like the present fact of death, are to render defunct overnight. Asterisk note. I've not included the dotted line on the right, this so as to give the pyramid something more like the correct proportions, while the baseline is purely arbitrary. Notice, however, how Temple Sowerby, that one-time Templar base see Article 3, presents itself as a possible entry point into the structure. Trust the Templars to know the doorway in, especially so when seeing that but 4 miles to the east of their garrison is a speck on the map denoted as Knock. All very nice for you, but why get a dose of the shivers from that name Hawk's Head? Well, and again, isn't a phoenix a kind of hawk? But more than this obvious confirmation of a firebird rising from the top of this lakeland pyramid, it was again to that Egyptian hawk, falcon-headed god Horus that my ecstatic thoughts then fled. And can you blame me now for my exuberance? Because what with that aforementioned tidy little scam-cum masquerade of Isis's idea of a hawk-like headdress so as to disguise Osiris, do you see now why I was, and still am so moved by this finding the village of Hawk's Head, of all places, marking the very apex of this great pyramid Benben stone of the Lake District, a pyramid born, just as that lump of old iron was at the forge, out of those lakes which magically double up as those oh so graphic tongues of fire, and which are of such paramount importance in the Phoenix's legendary liftoff. Bang on cue then, observe rising from this Hawk's Head tipped pyramid that great Aquarian phoenix itself, the Bennu bird, likewise a hawk, a falcon, and yes, in this context, all of them a phoenix by any other name, and its name is Horus, or rather now the self-resurrected Osiris. Simply, the name Horus signifies, but the risen Osiris, just as the name Christ signifies the risen Jesus. Indeed, via his own resurrection Jesus himself became a Horus, a phoenix risen, and what with all this exquisite imagery exploding from out of his own nail to the cross right hand, as though he's saying, "Look, see what I see, know what I know," along with our knowledge now that he also carries an opening of the mouth adds beneath his loincloth. Well, surely must he be telling us that it was that very ceremony which led to his own victory over death, and that it was those two gods of ancient Egypt, Osiris, Horus and Isis, who first inaugurated such. Moreover, surely in this same stupendous imagery Egypt's own Great Pyramid must as a direct consequence receive idiot proof, verification of Bauval's belief that here be no dusty tomb, but itself a resurrection machine. Asterisk note, oh, and before I forget, one of the attributes of Horus was that of his all-seeing eye. So when you see Hawk's head stationed at the very tip of this pyramid, see too the reverse of an American dollar bill, and whereupon is depicted a pyramid with its own apex bearing that same all-seeing eye. Interesting. Again, when witnessing this truly spectacular and uplifting imagery, seen visually spilling from out of the right hand of Cumbria's crucified Christ, and it being written so gigantically, combined height of pyramid plus phoenix being some 40 miles, upon the face of our now proved to be conscious and singing planet, the message can only be to the effect that every man jack of us can likewise defeat death, if we but only have faith as small as a mustard seed. In my very humble opinion, it must ultimately be this one emphatic message alone which has caused, or ignited, this whole miraculous mirror of the heavens to rise itself from out of the blazing core of our own planet, and thence up and up through our fields and cities in a visual cry of utter jubilation to this same death-defying fact, the same fact which must be likewise behind that exclamation of joy we found already written upon this Cumbrian Christ's own lips. I can think of no other reason for all that is dancing before our eyes. Christ being raised from the dead dieth no more, death has no more dominion over him. Romans 6 verse 9. Finally, and whether or not this artist has been sometimes right, or sometimes hopelessly wrong in these his desperate attempts in trying to look beyond the initial shock of all these star giants, this in effort to fathom a reason for their presence, the one undeniable fact remains that in the foundations of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, these zodiacal figures, plus a crucified Christ thrown in for good measure, exist, because maps don't lie. Likewise too, did that extraordinary self-created adze appear from out of the blacksmith's flaming forge, and you have seen photographs to prove it, see Article 3. All that said, I'm afraid that ultimately it's for each individual to wrestle with these strange invaders of our everyday rational minds, or then again, to simply dismiss the whole kit and caboodle as merely the product of an overly imaginative artist's mind, and with that be done with it. I earnestly hope, however, that for a few folk at least, and if for nothing else, that my discovery may fascinate enough so as to instill a feeling that there really is more to this life, and to this earth, than that which normally meets the eye, for I truly believe that just beyond the everyday known is a magic, indeed, a loving consciousness at work, and to which we have for too long been blind to. To those who still may think me crazy, however, can I just beg of you that this my baby, no matter how strange or even ugly it may look, isn't thrown out with all the bath water. And so with this last article, my 14-year-long guilt trip on account of the stuff that was deleted from my book Behold Jerusalem is now thankfully over. Although I must confess that some of the things described in these articles were only discovered or experienced, certainly those events surrounding my visit to the Cumbrian Christ's mouth, a blacksmith's forge, post-publication, God, it seems, really does work in mysterious ways. Midsummer's Day 2018, farewell, and many blessings to you all. GKGXXX